The dogs always spoke first low, restless murmurs that rippled through the pens long before a human ear would have called it sound. Peter Williams felt those vibrations in his ribs as he crouched beneath the kennel's shadowed eaves, wind moving the cane like breath across the earth. He had prepared himself the way a hunter does, but what glistened on his forearms was not war paint. Pig's blood slicked his skin and shirt in dark sheets, already tacky in the night air, sweet rotten on the tongue. He drew a slow breath through his teeth to blunt the nausea and let the copper taste anchor him to the moment. If fear had a scent, he would not allow the hounds to find it on him. They would find only this. The smell they had been taught meant hunger, pursuit, permission. The moon was new, a negative of light. Out on the Whitmore plantation, the fields stretched pale as a drowned sea under the stars, cotton bolls peeking through their grey cast like barnacles on a wreck. Somewhere in the rows, a nightjar called and answered itself. A chain clinked in the quarters, then stilled. The overseer always trusted the dogs to keep the dark honest. Tonight, Peter meant to teach the dark a different language. He had practiced this silence for years, first as a boy moving through the horse lot without spooking the skittish ones, then as a man tending fires in the smokehouse while others slept. He knew how to tuck his steps into the wind zone shuffling, how to make his weight an afterthought. The dogs had learned him by now the cadence of his approach, the soft even hum he made low in his throat, the meat-sweet offerings he braided with patience. The first time he came to them, they had bristled and shown gums like wet ivory, hackles stitched to their spines. But creatures do not remain mysteries to a man who knows how to listen. Peter listened as he worked. He watched the way the alpha scarred, deliberate, a monarch named Rex by a humorless hand claimed the bowl, the way the younger females hovered, the way the smallest male never quite believed food was real until it was between his teeth. He learned their names second, and their needs first. There is a story that travels in the bones from one shore to another. In an older country, across an older sea, there were people who spoke to animals, not in words but in posture, scent, and patience. People who understood that a dog's trust is not taken, it is traded. Enslavement had severed many names and maps, but not all habits. Peter had never called it magic. He called it attention. Still, in the quarters, women folding cloth by lamplight would whisper that he carried something in him the whip could not cut out, some thread back to a world where men and beasts stood eye to eye. If that were so, he kept it hidden like a coal under ash. Elias Ford, narrow, hard, and exact as a blade, had been hired to prove that nothing in Whitmore's fields resisted long. He believed in the arithmetic of pain. His dogs were his proof. It was not that they were cruel by nature. It was that he had taught them to read terror like a map. The day they tore Moses down in the sumac boy, running for a sister you could only visit by myth, Peter stood with his hands at his sides and learned what the dogs had been taught. Fear had been made their door. He understood then that doors swing both ways. In the weeks after, he called to the pack when no one watched, softened his shoulders, turned his face slightly aside the way canines do when greeting without threat. The first respect is not to stare. The second is to offer without taking. Bits of pork fat, bones that still remembered marrow, a tone like water over stone. When Rex finally allowed Peter's fingers to trace the line where an old chain had bitten the neck, the smallest female exhaled a pleased, almost embarrassed sigh. That was the hinge. After that, time did what patience asks of it. But tonight was not about softening. Tonight was about eclipsing. The blood on Peter's skin was not only mask and lure. It was a story told directly to their noses. This is hunt. This is the world narrowed to a single, permitted act. Ford's lessons had built a road. Peter had spent months paving over it with his own signs, quiet commands folded in at the edges, a whistle just lower than Ford's, a palm turned slightly different, a word bent at an angle the overseer had never used. Dogs live in a present sharpened by repetition. Change the repetition and you change the present. He had done it a handful of heartbeats at a time. Beyond the pens, Ford's cabin threw a thin slit of lamplight, and then swallowed it again. The man slept with windows open in heat, trusting the air and the dogs to keep him safe. Confidence like that can be a kind of blindness. Peter waited until the night stilled around the cabin, until the last ember in the overseer's stove settled with the sigh of tired iron. Then he rose and let the sharpened wire of the latch kiss his palm. The pen's gate creaked the way wood does when it remembers it was once a living thing. The pack felt him first with their noses. They came close on padded feet, no baying now, only the tremor of decision in their bodies as he pressed his blood-slicked hands to their snouts and let them read the plan. He was not their master. He would never claim that word. But he had become, in the way wolves remember a different grammar for authority. a voice they ranked inside their spine. He did not need to tell them what Ford had done. Animals do not require histories. They recognize vectors, fear points here, permission points there. Peter gave the smallest signal, 2 fingers angled, a breath drawn and released, and the pack leaned toward the cabin as if the house itself had whistled. Everything that must happen could be contained in a single unsheathed second. Peter could see it before it arrived. The window screen surrendering, the bone-colored flash of teeth, the startle that becomes a scream, the long arithmetic of Ford's making balanced by the shortest math in the world: action, consequence. He felt for a heartbeat the old ache of doubt, the one that asks whether a man becomes the thing he fights when he uses the enemy's weapons. But the ache met another truth. Terror is a tool, so is mercy. If you do not choose which one you wield, someone else will choose for you. He did not yet give the final call. There were other eyes in the night field, hands up with sick children, a woman on the steps with her head in her hands, a boy tracing a splinter in the board floor the way you trace routes you cannot walk. This is what plantations always were. 1,000 private nights held inside one public darkness. He thought of Sarah tied to the post while the pack had been made to dance bites along her legs, pain measured, humiliation precise, punishment as theater. Some spectacles are sermons. He let the memory sit in his mouth until it soured sweetly with the blood. At the edges of the yard, the wind leaned through the pines and whispered back. A log shifted in the smokehouse, his smokehouse, and let go of a thread of fat, thick incense that the dogs read alongside everything else. He had always believed the world was made of messages, sap rising and falling, soil telling rain when to stay, animals speaking a grammar of weight and breath. People ignore most of it and call the silence God's will. Peter studied it the way a literate man studies ink. He crouched and touched the ground with his fingertips, leaving no visible mark but letting the dogs see the gesture. A hand meeting earth is a promise. He had made unlikely promises before, to keep the older mare from collapsing in the traces by learning her limits and bending them gently, to outwait the anger in a feral cat's eyes until curiosity, that cousin of hope, blinked first, to refuse the shape Ford had poured for him, even when the shape fit like a coffin made to measure. Tonight's promise was simpler. The pack would not be asked to do more than they had already been trained to do. They would only be asked to do it for someone who had taught them kindness. If this were a sermon, a white preacher would later call it providence, that the moon vanished on this night, that Whitmore himself had ridden out to Savannah to chase debts, that no travelers had stopped by to widen the blast radius of consequence. But providence does not coil wire into latches or bleed hogs or wear the stink that drives sleep from a man's stomach. People do. Peter did, with his hands and his patience and the long arithmetic of revenge solved at a pace that does not satisfy stories or fire-eaters, but satisfies the truth. Change is a craft before it is a miracle. He rose, slow as a tide, and the dogs rose with him. Their bodies had the hush of a prayer that expects an answer. He let his lips shape a note low, almost a vibration, and felt the pack's attention snap taut. Somewhere in the quarters, someone murmured a line from a hymn about Jordan's water. Somewhere else, a child turned and dreamed of running through trees without stumbling. The plantation held its breath. Peter stepped, and the pack flowed, and the distance between the pens and the cabin shed itself like a snake's skin. He could feel the threshold gathering itself, the moment when thought collapses into deed. When he reached the shadow beneath the open window, blood drying to a drag across his forearms, he put 2 fingers to his mouth and gave the sound he had taught them in patient, stolen minutes, the one that meant, "Now, as one for me." The knight leaned forward to listen. The dog's muscles gathered like a sentence finding its verb. Inside, the overseer turned once in dream and settled again, as if sleep could be an argument against what waited in the air. Peter's heart beat once in his throat, once in his wrists, and then lowered itself into a steady march. When he moved, it was with the certainty of a man who has turned the gate's creak into consent, who has braided terror and trust into a single rope and decided which end to pull. He lifted his hand. Dawn had not yet broken over the Georgia sky, but the plantation already breathed its slow, aching rhythm. By the time the first light spilled across the cotton fields, hundreds of enslaved men, women, and children would already be bent double, fingers raw from plucking white tufts from their prickly pods. Cotton was called king, and on the Whitmore plantation, its reign was absolute. The fields stretched so far that when the wind rippled over them, it looked like a pale, endless sea, a sea that consumed lives one bowl at a time. The year was 1850, and the South was tightening its grip on both the land and the people chained to it. Plantations like Whitmore's were more than just farms. They were engines of wealth built upon human misery, maintained by the crack of the whip and the silent endurance of those who had no voice. Overseers rode the rows on horseback, their silhouettes sharp against the horizon, pistols heavy at their hips. The smallest infraction slowed work. Averted eyes, a whispered word could invite lashes that tore flesh and dignity alike. Yet amid this ocean of despair stood Peter Williams. At 28 years old, he had known no world beyond Whitmore's land. Born into bondage, he had grown tall and broad-shouldered, muscles sculpted by labor. But his strength was not what made him different. It was his eyes, quiet, watchful, seeing things others overlooked. Those who knew him sensed that he carried more inside him than he ever spoke aloud. Peter's gift had revealed itself early. As a boy, he had soothed colts too wild for seasoned handlers, guiding them with a soft hand and steady tone. He had tamed barn cats that hissed at everyone else, coaxing them to curl against his ribs as he worked. Even rattlesnakes, coiled and ready to strike near the woodpiles, slithered away when Peter lowered his voice to them, speaking as though he had bargained with the very earth. Some whispered that he was touched by something old African bloodlines that carried knowledge of animals, spirits and signs. Others thought it nothing more than patience. But to Peter, it was neither sorcery nor chance. He believed animals simply wanted to be heard, and he, unlike most men, had learned how to listen. This quiet intelligence earned him respect among the enslaved who, in whispered conversations, spoke of Peter as if he carried some hidden power. But it also marked him as dangerous in the eyes of those who measured worth only in obedience. He knew better than to show too much, to let his talents shine openly. A man who appeared too clever risked punishment or worse, sale to a harsher master. So Peter kept his head bowed and his words few, blending into the rhythm of toil. But he could not blend out Elias Ford. The overseer had arrived at Whitmore Plantation 3 years earlier, and his name carried its own legend of fear. Lean and sharp-boned, with pale eyes that seemed to strip a person down to their weakness, Ford had overseen plantations from South Carolina to Louisiana, leaving scars on everyone. He was not a man who shouted unnecessarily. His cruelty was cold, efficient, and exact. Where others used the whip, Ford used something worse. His dogs. 6 massive bloodhounds, muscle, fang, and instinct honed into terror. He trained them not only to track runaways, but to feast upon fear itself. When a man fled, their baying carried across the fields like a promise of inevitable capture. Their jaws were the overseer's true weapon, their growls the sound that haunted dreams. The slaves came to fear not just Ford, but the very shadows of the animals that padded at his side. Peter had seen them in action. One July morning, a boy named Moses, barely 17, had tried to reach his sister on a neighboring plantation. He never made it. Ford's hounds found him less than 5 miles out. When they dragged him back, his body was a ruin. Clothes torn to ribbons, arms and legs punctured by teeth, eyes staring blankly at a world that had closed its doors on him. He limped forever afterward, his spirit broken more than his flesh. That sight did not leave Peter. It planted a seed that slowly grew roots deep within him. If dogs could be taught cruelty, perhaps they could also be taught something else. But for now, Peter hid that thought. Each day unfolded the same. Dawn's whistle, the fields alive with bent backs, overseers circling like carrion birds. The smokehouse fires demanded his attention at odd hours, flames licking salted meat into preservation. That assignment, while grueling, granted him an unusual freedom to move while others slept. It was in those restless hours, while the plantation lay draped in silence, that Peter began to sense possibility. For though Ford's whip cracked loud, and his pistol gleamed cruel in the sun, Peter understood the truth no overseer could ever erase. These beasts, as fearsome as they were still animals. They longed for kindness, they craved trust, and Ford, for all his brutal training, had never given them that. And so, a man overlooked as ordinary, who had never known freedom's soil beneath his feet, began to dream of turning the master's sharpest weapon into his own quiet blade. Elias Ford's arrival at Whitmore Plantation had been like the sudden spread of fire across dry grass, swift, consuming, and without mercy. He was not a man who laughed, nor one who wasted words. Thin as a rail, yet hard as seasoned oak, he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had broken men before and expected to break them again. His pale, piercing eyes unnerved even other whites in the county. To the enslaved, those eyes were a sentence waiting to be carried out. Ford's reputation had preceded him. Stories traveled faster than wagons, overseers who left behind graves with no markers, women whose cries lingered long after he moved on, and fields where productivity rose not because of better tools but because fear had been sharpened to a weapon. It was precisely this reputation that made Master Whitmore hire him. Whitmore valued efficiency, and Ford promised it in abundance. What he delivered was discipline so brutal that whispers of rebellion quieted into resigned silence. But Ford's most feared instruments were not the whip that swung at his hip, nor the pistol gleaming in the Sunday. His pride, his terror, his legacy was the pack. 6 bloodhounds, each broad-shouldered, deep-chested, bred to run for hours and to lock their jaws until bone gave way. These were not mere tracking dogs. Ford had conditioned them to seek more than the scent of human flesh. They were taught to recognize fear itself, the sweat it carried, the panic it bled into the air. A trembling body was their signal, and a man who fled might as well have rung a dinner bell. The baying of those hounds became the sound that hollowed out courage. It echoed in dreams. It silenced mothers when children asked about freedom. It weighed on men's chests when they dared to look northward. More than once, slaves who thought to run turned back at the very thought of those dogs. Terror is the overseer's sharpest chain, and Ford had forged it well. Peter had seen them unleashed. He could never forget. Moses was the boy's name, 17, with quick legs and quicker hope. He wanted to see his sister, who had been sold to a plantation just a few miles away. 5 miles, it might as well have been 500. He slipped away before dawn barefoot, whispering a promise that he would return before the day's end. But Ford's dogs caught his scent by mid-morning. The baying rolled across the fields, and every enslaved soul froze at the sound. By the time they dragged Moses back, he was unrecognizable. His shirt was shredded, his arms gouged by teeth that had held him fast until Ford arrived to finish the lesson. His eyes, they were empty, staring past the sky as if searching for something he would never find. From that day on, Moses limped, his body marked, but worse still, his spirit silenced. The overseer paraded him through the quarters, a living warning. And it worked. Fear settled heavier than the Georgia humidity, pressing down on every chest, turning even whispers of escape into dangerous fantasies. But where others saw only terror, Peter saw something else. He had watched the dogs, not just when they attacked, but when they lingered afterward. He noticed how their tails wagged when Ford fed them scraps, how their ears perked when they caught the scent of fresh meat, how even their growls softened if one brushed too close without threat. They were killers when commanded, yes, but they were still animals. And animals, Peter knew, could be taught differently. That day, as Moses lay broken, a seed was planted in Peter's mind. It was faint at first, the kind of thought a man pushes aside for fear of its danger. But it grew quietly beneath his ribs. What if the same hounds that kept men enslaved could be turned into the very means of their master's undoing? For months, that question burned in him, small but steady. And as Ford strutted with his dogs, confident that they were extensions of his will, Peter began to watch with a sharper eye. He studied the way Ford commanded, the tones he used, the gestures of his hands. He noted which dogs responded fastest, which hesitated, which obeyed but longed for affection never given. He began to see the pack not as monsters, but as tools waiting to be reshaped. It was a dangerous thought treason in its infancy, but it was also a truth Peter could not ignore. If dogs could be taught to obey cruelty, then perhaps they could be taught to obey something else. And from that possibility, a plan began to take root, one that would require patience, courage, and the silence of a man who knew how to listen. The days slipped past like beads on a rosary, each the same as the one before sunrise over the cotton. Overseers circling like vultures, the fields whispering with bent backs and bleeding fingers. Yet beneath the monotony, something small but dangerous began to grow. In the smokehouse, where salt and fire gnawed at slabs of pork, Peter tended the flames and quietly studied the rhythm of Ford's world. The smokehouse was only 50 yards from the overseer's quarters, and behind that cabin stretched the kennel pens. From his post, Peter could watch the routines that most men ignored. Ford strutted out each morning to inspect the pack, his boots crunching gravel, his whip coiled loose at his side. The hounds pressed against the iron fencing, bodies taut with hunger not just for food, but for purpose. They craved touch, approval, connection. Ford gave them only commands and scraps. He used fear the way a smith uses fire, to harden, to shape, but never to nurture. Peter saw the gap. He saw the yearning left unfulfilled, and in that absence, he recognized his opening. The first step was patience. Weeks of it, he observed quietly from a distance, memorizing the hierarchy within the pen. Rex, the scarred alpha, carried himself with the dignity of a king who tolerated no disobedience. The younger females circled him like shadows, their loyalty tempered by a hunger for gentleness. The smaller male, nervous, hesitant, often hung back, waiting for scraps after the others had fed. Peter saw loneliness in his eyes. Even beasts trained to kill longed for something beyond cruelty. On a moonless September night, Peter moved closer. He carried with him scraps of pork swiped from the smokehouse, still warm with fat. He whispered as he walked, voice low, steady, like water rolling over stones. The dogs stirred. At first, they growled, lips curling, muscles tight as bowstrings, but Peter did not retreat. He lowered himself to the ground, palms open, the way a horseman approaches a spooked colt. He tossed a strip of meat through the fence. One of the younger females lunged first, snapping it up. She paused, sniffed, then wagged her tail ever so slightly. That was the hinge, the first crack in Ford's armor. Night after night, Peter returned. Always patient, always soft, always bearing gifts. He spoke to them the way he had once soothed frightened animals as a boy. Not in words, but in cadence, in rhythm, in the tilt of his shoulders that said, "I am not your enemy." Slowly the growls lessened, tails wagged. One night, the smaller male pressed his snout to the fence and allowed Peter's fingers to scratch behind his ears. By the following week, even Rex had lowered his head, accepting a morsel directly from Peter's blood-darkened hand. It was not enough to win their stomachs. Peter sought their trust. And once trust took root, training began. Carefully, secretly, he introduced new commands. Slight variations in tone from Ford's voice. A whistle pitched lower, a hand signal turned just so. Enough to feel familiar, but different enough that the dogs knew these belonged to Peter alone. They learned. Patiently, eagerly, they learned. He rewarded them not with fear but with kindness, and kindness proved more powerful than any lash. Each night, as the rest of the plantation lay in uneasy sleep, Peter's silent lessons wove a second loyalty into the hearts of Ford's hounds. Loyalty that bent not toward cruelty, but toward him. And in those hidden hours, crouched by the kennel with the dogs pressing against the fence to feel his hand, Peter realized something. The overseer's sharpest weapon was not unbreakable. It could be turned. It could be reclaimed. The seed had become a sapling, and soon it would bear its fruit. Autumn settled over Georgia with a quiet chill, the kind that made the nights longer and the air sharper. Harvest season pressed the slaves into back-breaking labor from dawn until stars returned, their bodies bent beneath sacks of cotton that weighed like stones on tired shoulders. Overseer Ford prowled the rows, pistol glinting in the sun, the pack of hounds baying from their pen whenever the overseer's whip cracked. To the enslaved, the dogs were terror embodied, but to Peter, they were something else, now partners in a secret covenant only he understood. His bond with them had deepened. What began with scraps of pork had evolved into something near miraculous. He had learned each of their natures the way another man might learn the moods of his own children. Rex, the scarred alpha, tested him longest, growling low at every visit as though to remind Peter that trust was not freely given. Yet even Rex, after weeks of patience, had begun to soften. One evening, when Peter reached through the iron bars, Rex leaned forward and pressed his heavy skull against Peter's palm. It was a gesture as old as wolves, an acknowledgement of another's authority. In that moment, the balance of power shifted. The younger females were easier, responding quickly to the warmth in Peter's voice. Their tails thumped softly against the dirt, betraying their eagerness even when their training demanded stillness. The timid male had become Peter's shadow, whining softly when he departed, desperate for the comfort Ford had never provided. The pack was no longer Ford's alone. They had been split, their loyalty carefully rewoven thread by thread until they looked at Peter not with suspicion, but with recognition. Trust, however, was only the foundation. Peter knew he would need more. He began layering in new signals, each carefully distinguished from Ford's commands. Ford would raise his hand sharply and bark an order. Peter, by contrast, would use an open palm, a whistle low in his throat, or a gentle click of the tongue. The dogs, intelligent and eager to please, quickly learned to separate the two languages. By day, they obeyed the overseer without hesitation, their performance unchanged. But by night, in the moonlit silence, they had another master. It was a dangerous game. A single misstep, a tail wagged at the wrong moment, a soft whine when Peter passed too close, and Ford's suspicion would fall like an axe. Yet the overseer remained blind. His arrogance convinced him that fear alone cemented obedience, that beasts could never give their loyalty to another. His cruelty had built the very weakness Peter now exploited. In the quarters, whispers began to circulate. though none dared speak them too loudly. Some noticed that the dogs no longer erupted in frenzy when Peter walked past. Others said they had seen him crouched near the pens at night, murmuring to shadows. Rumors formed, half believed, that perhaps Peter had been given a gift, that the blood of Africa carried in him a power to command even creatures bred for terror. In truth, there was no sorcery, only patience, kindness, and a steady hand, but whispers of magic were sometimes more powerful than truth. As the trust deepened, so too did Peter's plan. He studied Ford with the same intensity he had once given the hounds. The overseer's routines were as predictable as the seasons. Ford inspected the dogs each morning, circling the pen with hands clasped behind his back like a general surveying troops. He slept with his windows open in the heat, trusting the pack to be his guardians. He rarely feared the slaves. To him, they were already broken. His security was absolute, or so he believed. Every night, crouched beside the kennel, Peter weighed possibilities. He knew the risk. To fail meant death worse. It meant torture and reprisals against everyone he loved. Yet each time he remembered Moses's vacant stare, Sarah's screams beneath the snapping jaws, the whip cracking over bent backs. The choice became clearer. Ford had turned dogs into instruments of fear. Peter would turn fear itself into a weapon against Ford. And though the moment was not yet ripe, the hounds, tails wagging in the darkness, were ready. The season turned colder, and with it came Ford's most chilling display of power. It began with Sarah. She was young, no more than 20, with eyes that once carried the faint light of hope. Sarah had dared something simple, something human. She had written a letter to her children, sold away to another plantation. The message never reached them. Ford intercepted it, and in his cruel genius he saw an opportunity. He gathered the entire plantation into the yard. The slaves were forced to stand shoulder to shoulder, eyes downcast, the air heavy with dread. Ford dragged Sarah forward, tied her trembling body to a post, and ordered 2 of his dogs released. The pack bounded into the circle, muscles coiled, eyes gleaming in the lamplight. The crowd held its breath. The dogs circled her, snapping at her legs and arms, tearing at her skirts with a violence measured not to maim but to terrify. Their teeth left punctures, shallow but searing, each bite a lesson. Sarah's screams split the air, and the sound cut deeper than any lash. Children cried into their mothers' skirts. Men clenched their fists, powerless. Ford stood to the side, his face calm, almost clinical, as though conducting a demonstration for his own amusement. The message was clear. Words of love, words of hope, even words on paper could be crimes worthy of torment. Fear was not only the overseer's weapon, it was his performance, his theater of control. Peter stood among the crowd, his body rigid, his heart burning. He watched Sarah's agony, her sobbing pleas, the way her body sagged when at last Ford called the dogs away. She was left bloodied but alive, a deliberate choice. She would carry her wounds not only in flesh but in spirit, a living warning to every soul who witnessed her suffering. But Ford had miscalculated. He believed terror only broke people. For Peter, it did something else. Watching Sarah crumple against the post, he felt the quiet patience that had guided him for months harden into resolve. This could not go on. Ford's cruelty was not endless, not unbreakable. It would end, and Peter would be the hand to end it. That night, while the plantation lay restless in its forced silence, Peter returned to the dogs. They pressed eagerly against the fence, tails thumping softly. He whispered to them, not in words of comfort this time, but in commands carefully taught over weeks. They obeyed without hesitation. In their eyes he saw no confusion. They knew him as they had once known Ford, perhaps more so. As he stroked Rex's scarred head, Peter's thoughts crystallized. The overseer had believed fear made him untouchable, yet the very beasts he used to spread terror had been reshaped, their loyalty stolen with nothing more than kindness and patience. Ford's pride had blinded him. His arrogance would be his downfall. The plan, once a vague possibility, was now inevitable. It only needed timing, the dark of a new moon, the overseer alone in his quarters, and the pack, ready to answer a command they trusted more than any lash. Sarah's screams echoed still in Peter's ears, but they no longer weakened him. They sharpened him into something Ford had never imagined. A man who could take the overseer's sharpest weapon and turn it back upon its master. The season of fear was ending. The season of reckoning was near. The night chosen was as black as tar, the kind of darkness where even the stars seemed to hold their breath. A new moon hung absent from the sky, leaving the plantation cloaked in shadows. It was the kind of night made for secrets, and Peter intended to leave one behind that would never be forgotten. He had been preparing for weeks, collecting pig's blood from the smokehouse and storing it in hidden jars beneath the floorboards of his cabin. Tonight, he opened them one by one, dipping his hands and arms until the thick liquid clung to his skin, soaking into his shirt, dripping in slow rivulets down his chest. The smell was foul, cloying, enough to twist the stomach, but Peter did not flinch. This was his disguise, his shield, and his weapon. To the dogs, it would be the trigger, a scent they had learned to connect with the hunt, with frenzy, with permission. Every step toward the kennels was calculated. His bare feet made no sound on the hard earth. In the quarters, the enslaved slept fitfully, haunted by dreams of lashes and dogs. Only Peter moved with purpose, a shadow slipping between shadows. The hounds sensed him first. Their bodies stirred before he even reached the fence, noses pressed to the bars, tails twitching with recognition. They should have raised alarm, but instead they greeted him with a low chorus of whines, eager for his touch. Peter crouched low, whispering the commands he had taught them in stolen nights, words and whistles that belonged to him alone. One by one, they stilled, their eyes fixed on him, waiting. He worked the latch with steady hands. He had practiced this dozens of times, memorizing the weight and scrape of iron until it yielded without sound. The gate swung open. The pack did not surge out in chaos. They waited, muscles coiled, watching their true master. Peter's heart pounded like a war drum as he led them across the yard. The overseer's cabin loomed ahead, its shutters open to the night air, the faint glow of a dying lantern flickering within. Ford trusted his dogs to guard him, never imagining they might be turned. His arrogance had left the door unbarred, the windows half open, as though daring the world to challenge him. Tonight, the world would answer. Peter gave the signal, a low whistle, sharp but steady. The dogs stiffened, ears pricked, eyes locked on the cabin. He whispered again, his voice barely more than breath, and their bodies flowed forward, silent shadows on four legs. They padded up the porch steps, noses twitching at the scent of blood slicked on Peter's skin. Then, with one final gesture, two fingers raised, then cut through the air, Peter loosed them. The pack exploded into motion. Wood splintered as they burst through the open windows, claws scraping, teeth bared. Ford's scream shattered the night. It was high at first, startled, then raw with terror, as he stumbled awake to the sight of his own beasts descending upon him. The irony cut sharp in Peter's chest. The man who had ruled through fear was now consumed by it, the hunter dragged down by his own hounds. The dogs did what they had been trained to do, what Peter had retaught them to do, but this time their target was not some broken boy in the fields. It was the overseer himself. Ford fought, but it was useless. His pistol never left its holster. His whip lay coiled and forgotten at the bedside. The pack swarmed him, teeth sinking, claws raking. His shouts turned to gurgles, then to silence. Peter stood outside in the shadows, listening. The overseer, who had believed himself untouchable, was gone, undone by the very animals he had used to shatter others. Justice, cruel and bloody, had finally arrived. The cabin went still. Inside, the dogs panted. Their work done, Peter gave another whistle, low and sure. The hounds obeyed instantly, slipping back out into the night, blood staining their muzzles but their eyes calm, awaiting their master's next command. In that moment, Peter knew the world had shifted. Fear had changed sides. The overseer's screams still echoed faintly in Peter's ears as he led the dogs away from the cabin. The night was thick with silence again, broken only by their panting and the whisper of wind through the cane. For months, Peter had prepared for this moment, and now it was done. Yet his work was not finished, not if he wanted to live to see dawn. He brought the pack back to their pen, but when he reached the gate he hesitated. These creatures, who had once been chained as tightly to Ford's cruelty as the slaves themselves, pressed close against him, eyes gleaming with something more than obedience. They had tasted freedom, however brief, and Peter felt it in their stillness. To lock them away again would be to betray the bond they had forged. Slowly he stepped back, pointing toward the dark tree line beyond the fields. He whispered a final command, one he had never spoken before. Go. For a heartbeat they lingered, reluctant to leave him. Then, as if understanding, they turned as one and slipped into the Georgia wilderness. Their bodies melted into the shadows until nothing remained but silence. They were free at last, like ghosts released from a long torment, destined to roam where no whip could reach them. Peter turned back to his task. Ford's body would be discovered soon, and when it was, suspicion would fall heavy across the plantation. He needed misdirection, a trail that pointed anywhere but toward him. Moving quickly, He used Ford's own knife to shred a shirt, scattering pieces into the dirt leading northward. He dipped the cloth into the overseer's blood, smearing it along fence posts and branches. The false trail told a story. Raiders, abolitionists, or escaped slaves had come in the night, struck down the overseer, and fled toward freedom. In the smokehouse, Peter gathered the jars that once held pig's blood. He buried them deep beneath the ash pit, then returned to his cabin to burn the clothes he had worn. The flames licked greedily, devouring every trace of his part in the night's work. He scrubbed himself clean in the creek, the icy water cutting through the stench until only faint stains remained. By the time the sky began to pale with morning light, Peter was back at the smokehouse, tending the fires as though nothing had changed. His face was calm, his hands steady, but inside, he carried the weight of what he had done. When Ford's absence was finally noticed, chaos erupted. Overseers and patrols scoured the fields, shouting his name, searching for signs of his whereabouts. It was another day before they found him in his cabin, torn and lifeless. Panic spread among the whites. Fear among the slaves turned to quiet, secret astonishment. The false trail leading north only deepened the mystery. Some swore abolitionists had struck in the night. Others muttered about escaped slaves returning for vengeance. None suspected the quiet man who stoked the smokehouse fires, whose face revealed nothing but weary obedience. The dog's absence puzzled everyone. Search parties combed the woods, convinced the valuable hounds had been stolen, but they found nothing, only silence in the trees where the pack now roamed free. Whispers soon turned to superstition. Some claimed the dog's spirits haunted the grounds, preventing any new hounds from taking their place. Others said Ford's ghost had carried them away. Peter said nothing. He worked as he always had, silent, steady, his grief carefully measured. But deep inside, he carried a secret victory, a private justice known only to him and the wilderness where the dogs now ran. For the first time in years, the plantation was quiet. No baying split the night. No shadow of hounds haunted the enslaved when they dreamed of escape. The overseer was gone, and with him, the whip of terror he had held in his teeth. Peter had turned fear itself against its master, and though no one knew, the taste of freedom was already spreading like fire beneath the ash. Ford's death left a vacuum on the Whitmore plantation, one that could not be filled by whips alone. Within a week, Master Whitmore returned from Savannah and appointed a new overseer, a man named Roberts. Roberts was strict, yes, but he lacked Ford's particular cruelty. He relied on order, not spectacle, and without the constant menace of the dogs baying through the night, the air itself seemed lighter. For the enslaved, it was as if a storm cloud had finally lifted. Men walked with their shoulders straighter. Women dared to whisper again by the fires. Children laughed without fear of hounds snapping at their heels. The change was subtle, but unmistakable. Ford's shadow had been long, and now it was gone. Peter watched these shifts carefully. He remained the same, outwardly quiet, obedient, the man who kept the smokehouse fires burning. To Roberts, he was just another laborer. But inside, Peter carried a different fire. He had proven to himself that resistance was possible, even in the belly of bondage. And once that knowledge took root, it could not be uprooted. It was not long before opportunity knocked again. One night, while tending his fires, Peter stumbled upon a small group of runaways. They were gaunt, barefoot, their clothes in tatters. Their leader was a woman who called herself Freedom, a name she had chosen after slipping away from a Louisiana sugar plantation. She and her companions were following faint whispers of a network routes, safe houses, allies that guided slaves northward to free soil. They called it the Underground Railroad. Freedom studied Peter with sharp eyes and seemed to recognize something in him, a quiet strength, a man who knew how to keep secrets. She asked for food, water, a place to rest. Peter gave them more than that. He offered knowledge of the land, paths that twisted through swamps, places where patrols never ventured, streams where scent was washed clean. He knew these things from years of quiet observation, from nights walking the grounds while others slept. Helping them ignited something in him. He realized that what he had done with Ford did not have to end there. His skills, patience, secrecy, an instinct for animals and people alike could be turned to a greater cause. And so Peter began to work, quietly, steadily, becoming a link in the chain of the Underground Railroad that stretched through Georgia. At first he helped cautiously, a loaf of bread here, a whispered warning there. But soon his role grew bolder. He learned to leave coded signs, chalk marks on trees, broken twigs bent in a certain direction, small piles of stones that pointed the way north. He memorized patrol routes, mapping in his mind the web of danger that laced the countryside. He even used his smokehouse duties as cover, moving freely at odd hours without raising suspicion. Every successful escape sent ripples of hope through the quarters. Whispers spread. Someone was helping, someone quiet, someone trusted. No one spoke Peter's name, but in the glances they gave him, he saw the flicker of recognition. He had become something more than a man chained to the fields. He was an architect of possibility, a silent engineer of freedom. And just as Ford's death had proved that no master was untouchable, Peter's new work proved something even greater, that the walls of slavery had cracks, and through those cracks, light could slip in. Seasons turned, and with them, Peter's secret life widened into something larger than even he had first imagined. The Whitmore plantation still ground on, cotton picked and weighed, lives traded like coin, but beneath its surface another rhythm beat. Slaves whispered of distant escapes, of families vanishing into the night and never returning. Overseers muttered about abolitionist plots. Patrol riders cursed the endless rumors, and through it all Peter worked silently, his hands tending fires while his mind mapped routes north. When the chance finally came, he was ready. Whitmore's debts grew heavy, and talk spread that certain slaves, including Peter, might soon be sold southward. The threat was too great. He would not wait for fate to chain him to another master. On a storm-thick night, rain drumming the earth like war drums, Peter slipped away. He followed paths he had once traced for others, paths hidden beneath swamp reeds and pine shadows, always moving with the patience that had carried him this far. The journey was brutal. Patrols scoured the countryside, dogs bayed in the distance, but none were Ford's hounds. Those beasts had vanished into the wilderness years before, and their absence was a wound the white men still could not mend. Peter traveled under storms, across rivers, through fields where the soil clung like tar. Each safe house, each ally, carried him further north until at last, after weeks of peril, he crossed into free soil. From there he pressed onward, through states where bounty hunters still prowled, until the land opened into Canada. In a small town near Toronto, he found something he had never known: true freedom. He became a blacksmith, hammering iron with the same steady patience that had once won the trust of dogs. But his work did not end with his own liberation. He joined abolitionist circles, aiding newly arrived escapees, teaching others the skills of secrecy and survival that had saved his life. Word of him traveled, carried in whispers across the Underground Railroad. His name became legend among the enslaved, a story of a man who had turned the master's own hounds upon him, a tale of cunning and courage. Some said he had commanded the dogs with sorcery, others that the spirits of Africa had guided him. In truth, it was patience, intelligence, and an unbroken will. But legends need not be precise to inspire. Years later, hunters in Georgia spoke of a strange pack roaming the forests, large, clever, always just out of reach. They said the dogs avoided traps, vanished before rifles could fire, and howled at night in tones too human to ignore. To some, they were ghosts. To others, they were Ford's hounds, living reminders that cruelty can be turned against its master. Peter grew old in Canada, surrounded by children and grandchildren who had never felt the overseer's lash. Sometimes, as the forge glowed and sparks leapt like fireflies, he would think back to that night: the blood, the whistle, the crash of glass, and Ford's screams swallowed by his own beasts. It was not pride he felt, nor sorrow, but something harder to name. A certainty, perhaps, that even in the darkest chains, resistance was possible. The story of Peter Williams became more than memory. It was a beacon, proof that the tools of oppression could be seized and broken, that fear itself could change allegiance. Long before the Civil War thundered across the South, one man had struck his own quiet blow, and though history rarely speaks his name, his act carried the scent of freedom, one that no amount of training, no whip, no overseer could ever erase.